All right. Well, hello, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning or good day, depending upon where in the world you're joining us from today. So I'm Val Schwartz, and I'm the head of admissions at NC State University's Institute for Advanced Analytics. And welcome to the latest installment in our Exploring Data Science webinar series. You can find recordings of our past webinars on our YouTube channel, which I will pop into the chat for you all. There you go. And today I'm really excited to have here with us one of our fabulous alumni, Viola, who graduated our Master of Science in Analytics program in 2016. She's the lead data scientist for the Democratic National Committee. She's based out in San Diego, California. And she's here today to discuss how political campaigns use data and analytics. So if you have questions for Viola, please feel free to enter them in the chat, and we'll have time after her presentation to address those. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Viola.
Thank you, Valerie. Let me get my screen shared here with folks. And thanks everybody for joining us today. Very excited to chat about this. Valerie, can you see the presentation?
Yeah.
Everything good? Okay, perfect. Okay, so as Valerie introed, I'm going to talk about how we use data science and analytics and data in general in political campaigns from the experience that I have had working in that field. More broadly, I'm going to talk a little bit about myself as well at the beginning, my path and my current role. Then we'll talk a bit very high level about how campaigns work and some of the decisions that we're making, what it means to do analytics work from within a campaign, and then talk specifically about the tools that our team uses in our political data science work. There's lots of different political data science spaces. This is just representative of one of them. And then we'll look through a couple of quick case studies, very high level, open-ended thought experiment type case studies to give you an idea of the kinds of problems that we think about versus presenting the actual solutions that we have. I promise you there are really wonderful solutions to all of these things and more coming down the pipeline, but we will think about it in a more theoretical way. And then I'm going to spend just a minute or two at the very end talking about getting started in this field. This is like a question that I get from folks a lot, especially people connected with the Institute. So I wanted to also make sure to acknowledge that and talk about it a little bit here. So this is me. I'm Viola Glenn. My pronouns are she and her. I am the head of data science for the Democratic Party, which is amazing and something I love saying out loud. And I'm also part of the IAA alumni network in the class of 2016. So my career path, which I have historically always called really nonlinear and enjoyed being able to make a nonlinearity joke as a data scientist. But when I put it down here, it actually seems quite linear. It's like when you get to the end of something, it's easier to see that the path actually made sense. But while you were on the path, sometimes it can feel a little bit like you're lost. So I started my career as an environmental economist, and I did that for about 8 years. Really fascinating work, trying to use a lot of analytics to get at the value of environmental goods for various reasons. And after I did that for 8 years, I needed to get an advanced degree to continue to move forward in my career. So I went to graduate school and got a graduate degree in agricultural and development economics, and went to work at a North Carolina favorite after that at RTI International, where I worked on intersectional policy, intersectional between agriculture and transportation and environment. Also really interesting work, but I got to a place with that where the complexity of the problems that I wanted to work on, the skills that I had in just econometrics didn't really keep pace with the complexity of the issues that I was really interested in. And that's what started me being interested in data science. I think data science takes a lot of our fundamental principles from econometrics and statistics and combines that with computer science and allows us to just really have much more flexibility in what we can accomplish and the kinds of problems that we can look at. So that was my pivot towards data science. I very much used my time at IAA to make that pivot and went back to grad school, got my second graduate degree, and came out of IAA very intentionally looking to not work in the research and nonprofit sector, but wanting to be in the private sector. And I went to a financial technology startup called Elevate. They have historically had a really good relationship with the Institute. I don't know where that is now, but I'm sure there's like some familiarity with that. And had the opportunity to really practice my technical skill in a really technical environment with great peers in that setting. And then from a personal perspective, the 2016 election, the presidential election happened, and that had a really big impact on me as just like a personal human, as it did for a lot of people in different ways. And that was my moment. I had a very good friend who's a lawyer who volunteered with the Democratic Party in the 2016 election to do voter protection work. And I found myself thinking, I wish I had a skill that I could dedicate to this work. And eventually figuring out, of course, there is a lot of data science happening in the political field. I just needed to find the right place to plug in and to figure out what my story was going to be there. What that ended up being was joining the DNC data science team in 2018. And I held the senior data science role for the 2018 cycle and the 2020 cycle, both really good times to be at the DNC. In 2018, we elected the most diverse congressional set of candidates that has ever been elected in US history. And I got to be part of that. And then in 2020, we know what happened in 2020. That was also very exciting. And I moved into the lead and head role in 2021. Just late last year. So still relatively new, or midway through last year. There we go. So my current role, this is a very different role compared to when I was in the senior role. There are still technical components to the work that I do, but I don't do a lot of individual contributor work anymore. Most of what I do is I am supporting my team in their individual contributor work, their IC work. That looks like technical coaching, so being really aware of our projects and decisions that are being made, the justification for those decisions, design processes, those sorts of things with individuals on a one-on-one basis or on a team basis. I do a lot of vendor and stakeholder relationship management. There's a lot of different groups involved in the work that we do, so making sure that I'm tracking that whole space and looking for places where there's overlap and strategic advantage. Doing roadmap planning, so figuring out what it is we're going to do at different parts of the year and different parts of the election cycle, how we're going to implement that, making those trade-offs. And we also do data science in an agile structure. So managing that process in conjunction with pretty significant support I get from our product team to manage that process. On the non-technical side, this is a much bigger part of my current role than it has ever been before. And part of my work that I really, really love is that I get to work on hiring and be very, very intentional and thoughtful about that, setting norms for the team from a cultural perspective, creating a really collaborative environment, figuring out what it means to be a successful remote data science team. We at the DNC on the tech team have been remote since 2018. So we were doing it before it was COVID cool to do it. We're pretty experienced at it and will continue to be remote going forward. And then my other two big non-technical concepts that I think about in this role are psychological safety on the team. You can Google that. It's like a pretty standard tech thing these days, but it is creating this environment where we feel really comfortable to exchange ideas and collaborate and are not competitive, but are more cooperative. And then bringing my own authenticity and making it possible for my team to bring their authenticity to the table. So to that, I'm also a whole human. Outside of my current role, there's also other things about me. I live in sunny Southern California. I spend a lot of time parenting the coolest 5.5-year-old you will ever meet, being outdoors and enjoying music. Okay, so why the DNC? This is one of our Zoom shots. So this is campaigns, committees, and vendors. There's different actors in the political data science space. There are campaigns, which most people are familiar with. There's the committees, like the national committee, the party itself, but we also have sister committees who sit at different parts of the infrastructure. And then there are vendors who also work in the space are usually private companies who develop data science products or data and analytics products that they will sell to the campaigns and the committees to support individual campaigns. So I could have ended up in any of these places when I made the decision to move into this part of the data science world, but I ended up at the DNC mostly because in 2017, our previous chairman, Tom Perez, made a really significant investment of resources and time and just political capital to make the DNC the place in the progressive tech ecosystem that was going to be a permanent home for some of our longer term infrastructure projects. So historically, politics has been very subject to a boom and bust cycle. We have very big events that dictate a lot of what we are doing in a given moment. And we run at breakneck speed towards those big events because they're important. There's no flexibility in the timeline. We often joke that we're the only organization that has a constitutionally mandated ship date for our products. And that also has meant that after these big events, it's really hard to maintain all of the innovative ideas and solutions and things that were built on the last cycle because people are exhausted. There isn't a lot of funding after election day because there's a tremendous incentive for you to go through all of your funding leading up to election day. But he made the commitment that we were going to fund a permanent technology team at the DNC whose job would explicitly be to think long-term infrastructure, big picture, to absorb a lot of the innovation that happens on campaigns and adapt it so that we can share it with the rest of the ecosystem. And that's just really consistent with like how I want to be in the world. That's how my brain works very naturally. So that was a really good fit. The other part is that we work with everyone from the DNC. I don't work on a single campaign. I work with thousands of campaigns every single cycle. I work with state parties from all of the different states. And I get to have that really broad exposure to the entire ecosystem. And the final piece, why am I still here almost 4 years later, which is a very long time to work in one place, especially in tech, is the people. It's like kind of a cheesy answer, but it is also very true that this team, these like smiling faces here on Zoom, it is the best team I've ever worked with. It will be the best team I have ever worked with. I'm very aware of that. There's so much heart in this organization and I love being part of it and will continue to be part of it for some time. Okay, so now let's actually talk about the political campaigns side of things. So one thing I really want folks to walk away from this conversation remembering is that the type of data science that I do is very focused on resource allocation and optimization. It is not focused on election projections. Whenever people find out what I do, just based on the title, there is a lot of presumption that the focus of my work is to predict election outcomes. That is rarely my goal. There is some prediction that goes into our work, but it is to support our resource allocation decisions. It's not to know what's going to happen at the end of the day. So very succinctly, my goal is not to predict the most accurate outcome. It is to run the most efficient and effective campaigns. So one way to break this down that I talk about a lot when I interview folks to join the team is that the ideal is that every single campaign that is running, every single cycle gets to talk to every single constituent about every potential issue in exactly the right channel at exactly the right time. But in real life, campaigns are constrained. We only have so much calendar time. We need volunteer capacity to do all of this outreach and this voter contact. There's staffing constraints and there's funding constraints. So I think probably everyone here has enough familiarity with analytics and what it means to work in data to know that this is like the perfect combination of factors for doing the kind of work that we do. Each piece of this really naturally lends itself to some kind of optimization framework and resource allocation work. So again, just making this like super, super concrete. This is basically the decision that we're working with over and over and over again. And how do we scale? Answering this question is something like, I'm running a campaign and I have 5 volunteers that have 4 hours that they will dedicate to whatever it is I ask them to do tonight. How can I best use these resources to get closer to my goal of winning this election 3 months from now? So there's lots of different pieces there that we can break into individual bite-sized analytics problems, and that is what we are continuously doing. And that lends to this mindset that we are trying to optimize everything. There's lots of points where we can add that optimization. How do we translate all of those individual decisions into scalable data science solutions? And then how do we associate those with some level of impact so that we can rank where we spend our time? Thinking a little bit about what do campaigns do? You see the external facing parts of campaign work, but there's so much that goes on inside of that mechanism to support that work. And I'm going to go over high level the activities that we're up to and throw in a couple examples of ways that we can use analytics to support those activities. But I'll go into a couple of slightly more specific case study examples for each of these in the next section as well. So the first thing you're doing on day one is starting your volunteer recruitment efforts. And if you want to think about that, there's lots of reasons that we're doing that. One of them is just the scaling question. If we want to be knocking 200,000 doors a day in 3 months to get these votes out the door, then we need to be recruiting volunteers right now to get them trained, to get them involved, just to start that process running. We're also interested in volunteer recruitment because that's political engagement. If you come into a campaign and you have a good volunteer experience, you are going to walk out of that much more politically engaged, and that has all kinds of benefits downstream as well. So a couple of tools that we can use to support those efforts. There's volunteer propensity modeling. So we can go through the voter file and very systematically score each person that is in there based on the probability that they will respond positively to a volunteer ask, and use characteristics about our past volunteers to find new volunteers for specific candidates to start those recruitment processes. Once we get those first few volunteers, we can then use word of mouth and other tools to bring more folks in, but it's nice to have some kind of data-driven tool to start that process. And again, to allow us to scale things really meaningfully. The second part on this and on everything that we do, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later too, is contact mode modeling. So once you've decided that there is a tremendous probability that if you reach out to Viola Glenn, she will say, yes, I would like to volunteer with your campaign, there's a whole separate set of optimization questions about how should you get in touch with Viola Glenn? Should you knock on her door? Should you call her on the phone? Should you send her a text message? And being able to predict and optimize those things is also really helpful for a lot of the work that we do. As you're starting your volunteer recruitment, the other thing that you are always doing is fundraising. So this, in particular, the way that the data science team can support this kind of work is through grassroots fundraising. So there's large donor fundraising, which is more personal relationships focused, but the grassroots work is, again, looking at all of the people that are out there and looking at our small dollar donors historically and trying to find more people that look like that so that we can bring them into our funding structures. So everything we do is going to require funding, and we need to kick off that process immediately and keep it running along the way. So very similar to the volunteer process, we can look at things like donation propensity, who is likely to make a donation to a major political party when they are asked. We can also look at things like the channel that we should reach them in. Should we do something digital, something by the mail, something by the phone, and look at the time in the cycle when that is best to reach out to them. All of those different pieces are things that are subject to analytics work. So that's the groundwork. We're getting everything ready for the part of the campaign that folks actually see, which is more on the voter contact side. Once we have our systems in place, we have our staffing up and running and our volunteer networks trained and ready to go, we move into the voter contact phase of the process. The first, and this is kind of in chronological order of how this work happens. So the first stage is that we're finding folks who aren't even registered to vote yet and getting them registered. So this is like very characteristically, you see folks outside of grocery stores that you're going into who are trying to register you to vote. Where they are sitting and when they are sitting there is not random. That is also an analytics product that is telling campaigns how to prioritize geographies based on data inputs, and optimizing our volunteer allocation based on where we're likely to have the most impact with the populations that we're trying to talk to. So that's the first step, is to get as many new voters on the file as possible in the early stages of the campaign. The second stage, we start to think about persuasion. This is what people, often when I speak to them, they think this is like all campaigns do. It's actually kind of a small part of what campaigns do, because it's pretty rare that you can actually persuade someone from within a political campaign. There's a lot of caveats to that, and it really depends on like where you are. But again, when we think about our resource allocation issues, this is a very difficult place to create movement. So we're very strategic about how we make investments there, but this is disproportionately representing what people think political campaigns are about versus what the actual work is. But it is a really critical part of what we do. Some tools we can use there is issue modeling. So folks are likely to be persuaded by different topics. There are topics that are really, really near and dear to your heart. And if we have tools to identify what those topics are, that really helps our volunteers initiate conversation with you. If I know that you really care about issue A, I want my volunteer to be positioned to start a conversation with you about that, but for them also to be prepared for that conversation and have their talking points in order so that they can meaningfully engage with you. The second part is not just what to talk to people about, but there's also the persuadability modeling. So are you even persuadable? Most people, frankly, are not very persuadable. You've already made your decision, and that's not something that we can actually impact. But finding the people who are in that middle ground and making sure that we're focusing our persuasion conversations on that audience from an efficiency perspective. And then the final push, this is happening really towards the end of the campaign cycle, is that our voter contact really switches to get out the vote, GOTV. So this is just getting people the information that they need to vote on election day. At this point, people's decisions have been made about which candidate they're going to support, and probably about whether or not they're going to show up. But we'll be sending them things like their polling location. We'll be sending them information about, these days in particular, vote method. Have you made your plan for how you're going to vote? Are you going to vote by mail? And if you're going to vote by mail, here's the activities that you can do to get ready for that and make sure that your registration and paperwork and everything are up to date. And a couple of products that we look into for that is your party support probability or your candidate support probability. Those are two different things we use in different settings. And the probability or propensity to turn out, which is to show up on election day. And we'll talk more about those two components in the case studies as well. But that is what we shift to at the very end, is just giving you the information so that you will walk out your door and actually complete the task of voting. And that just, again, it shifts how we're approaching things, the information we're providing our volunteers with, and to a certain extent, the people that we're talking to. Okay, next stop is how we actually start to integrate data science. This is probably more accurately analytics, but through a data science heavy lens into some of these things. So a little bit more context. Pop quiz, do I make election projections? Kind of, but really that is not the focus of my work. The focus of my work is targeting. I'm very focused on supporting campaigns and being effective and efficient, not predicting outcomes. A very data sciencey way to think about this is that most of my work is in rankings, not probabilities. So a probability that is well calibrated will say something like, if I have a population of folks with a probability of supporting the Democratic Party of 0.9, 90% of those folks will actually support the Democratic Party, that my predicted score actually matches what is happening in real life. And that's very important when you are thinking about predicting the outcome of an election. Versus a ranking just says, if we ranked all the people in this county by who is most likely to show up on election day and vote for our candidate, here are the ranking is going to be correct, that like the probability that I will show up and do that is higher than yours, and we are ranked appropriately. When you are doing targeting work, most of what you care about is the ranking, because you're just trying to say, I found this universe, I can't contact all of them, who should I contact first? And that really changes a lot of how we do the design work that we do, and where we put our emphasis is that our focus is on that targeting ranking side of the house, not on the probability projection calibration side of the house. The other part of this that's really important is that everyone wins and loses elections at the margins, and we are looking for those margins. Like the one place that we do use projections is to try and get an idea of where our race is close, because that's where we want to apply the most analytics, because that's where it's actually going to make an impact. If we can find a place where we need to swing 300 votes and that will change the outcome of an election, it makes much more sense for us to allocate our resources to those populations than it does somewhere else where the margin is much, much wider. So there's a lot of that strategy that goes into our work and helps us focus our efforts. It's also useful because that helps me understand exactly where, or helps me feel like my work has an impact, because I know that I have the ability to focus it on places where it's really going to swing the outcome. Almost final piece is that the DNC itself does not run much of our own program. We are not out there actually running elections. We support folks who run elections, and we provide kind of like open source resources for our campaigns. So that kind of changes the whole environment that I'm practicing political data science in. And then the final piece is that the main like analytical tools that we use on our team are around experimental design and predictive analytics and machine learning. I'm going to take a quick peek at the chat because I see there's stuff in here.
Lots of questions, and you're welcome to take them as you go, or if you want to wait until later on, you can do that too.
Yeah. I am going, oh, there are lots. This is great. Thank you for the engagement. I really appreciate the questions. Please keep them coming. And I will come to these here at the next slide transition. Okay, so thinking about the modes of analytics that we are using on our team. The first big one is experimental design. The way that I historically thought about experimental design was more of a treatment effect approach. So tools like causal inference, sample size, statistical power, hypothesis testing. A very specific example of that would be places where you want to establish cause and effect. If I treat voter A with message B, will their voting behavior change? Mostly, will they then decide to vote for my candidate? I do not run these kind of programs. The DNC does not run these kind of programs internally. There are vendors who specialize in this. We don't have strategic advantage to run this kind of testing, but there are folks who have built their entire business model on doing exactly these things. And so we partner with them in those situations to provide tools to our campaigns that can support them in this work. But this is a place where I have to have significant competency, because I work with those vendors and I'm helping our campaigns make decisions about what makes sense. And I think any space where there is experimental design happening is a place where there's going to be a range in how well people are executing that experimental design and what that means about the output. So what I have to be capable of doing is interacting with these vendors and understanding enough about what it means to establish cause and effect in that environment to make good informed decisions for our team and for the general ecosystem about how that works. How I actually use experimental design on the team is looking at our new data science products and thinking about what it's going to look like to run some of those in the field. So we can build something internally, and we do a lot of validation to give ourselves an idea of how it's going to perform once we implement it. But there's still a difference between looking at historical data and having an expectation of performance versus actually deploying something. So we'll do things like create contact universes using a new product, and then create a similar universe not using that product, implement them both through a call program, a phone bank, and see what the results are compared to each other. And if you don't set that up with good experimental design, you're not going to get really robust findings from it and be able to say with confidence what has happened between the different products or between the product and the no treatment. We will also sometimes have different versions of models that we could roll out for our campaigns, and we want to test those different versions to make the final decision about what it is that will roll out. So an example of that could be thinking about education modeling. We want to be able to predict your level of education that is very related to your voting behavior. And there's lots of different ways we can do that. We could do a binary classification of do you have a college degree or not, or we could do a three-way classification of do you have some college, a college degree, or graduate work. We could do even further levels of that, up to the 6 levels that the census does. So we might spin up 2 versions of that and test both of them and see what the overall impact is at the end of the day, and make our decision about what we're going to roll out at a broader scale. And then the final other place that I'll use it is very similar to that approach of testing the performance of different tools, but doing that with vendors in our space. Okay, the second big piece of our work is in predictive analytics, machine learning flavored predictive analytics. So a lot of what we do is binary and multi-class classification, regression. We're using a lot of tree-based algorithms, but we also have custom algorithms that we've developed in-house for our very niche purposes, where there are things that just don't exist to do those things yet. The other big part, aside from the kind of statistical tools that we use, are on the operations side. So there's a lot of work to go from, I created a model that predicts the probability that you support the Democratic Party, to that model is useful to our user base. So how do we get that out to our users in the first place? And once it's out, how is it maintained? Are we doing batch scoring, where we will rescore every new person on the voter file once a month? Or are we continuously scoring people as they come in? How are we monitoring things like performance degradation? How do we know when a model needs to be refreshed or changed, or when the environment has shifted to such an extent that it's just not working anymore? That side of the house as well. The tools that we actually use, our individual scientists work in SQL, Python, and R. This is also a pet peeve of mine. Everyone always comes to me and says, should I learn R? Should I learn Python? You should learn SQL. Start with SQL. And then you can pick R or Python. It doesn't really matter. Our production models are in both Python and R. There are certain things that both of those are good at, so we provide space for both of them to be productionalizable. And then we have other products that we use for managing our models, keeping track of our experiments, what's in production, what has been depreciated, those sorts of things. Our automation and scheduling of when scores are going out, when universes are refreshed, when our optimizations are rerun, and our data warehouse itself, which stores all of our data. Okay, I will stop and take some of these questions before we move into the next section. I can read them. I saw you come off mute, Valerie, so I was like, maybe we're going to tag team this.
I can totally read some off to you if you want, or if you want to take them, your call.
Okay, I'll take them. Okay, so the first one is, I always see a lot about volunteering with candidates and parties. Do you primarily work with full-time staff, or do you work with a lot of volunteers? I myself work mostly with full-time staff. I'm pretty far divorced from our field organizer efforts at this point. I also work as a volunteer for campaigns when we are in the heat of campaign season. So I will work both as a volunteer and from within the organization itself, but I'm working with the full-time data science staff and then our full-time organizing staff, but mostly full-time folks. Next is, does issue modeling get communicated to candidates so they can be strategic about what they prioritize? Yes, it does. And could it even shape their stances on issues. I don't know, I'm not like in the mind of these candidates to see what shapes their stances. I am more usually thinking about how it will shape the way that we message about their stances and about different issues. So we can test different ways to talk about things, and we will find messages that resonate the most with folks and are the least likely to like agitate folks. And that's the kind of messaging we're gonna move forward with for the most part. Next from Grant, how do you think about the value that analytics focused organizations external to the DNC succeed or fail at contributing beyond what is done internally? Are their efforts better invested elsewhere? I think we as the progressive space at least do a very good job of adopting a really cooperative stance where we're like happy to cooperate with other organizations that are in the space. And I think lots of them, and I will talk about a couple of these at the end, lots of them do a very good job of having good communication with us. Like that's part of the stakeholder management that I do, is keeping track of all the different players in the field and allowing us the opportunities to find places where we can like complement each other instead of compete with each other accidentally for resources. And there's always more work to be done there, but for the most part, I feel like as a landscape, we do really well at that. And that certainly I benefit from plenty of these organizations outside of the DNC that are doing this work elsewhere. We have so much to do, and we are at the end of the day a nonprofit. So I'm never gonna turn away additional help from folks outside of our direct ecosystem. Okay, from Dan, do you find yourself mostly focusing on predictive power, or is it best to find interpretable models? I'm a little bit middle ground on this. I think this is like also a personal philosophy thing. I'm quite focused on predictive power. That's the impact for the type of work that I do. That's also what I love about data science, is that it's very prediction focused. Interpretability, though, is also very, very important to me. We do a lot of fairness, accountability, and transparency work on this team, and interpretability is like paramount to transparent work. So I think the way that that works out for me, though, is I am making decisions based on predictive power, but I am always pushing us to use the simplest solution that we possibly can to maintain interpretability. I think given all the tools we have now in the interpretability space, we can do much more complex things and not compromise our interpretability. But I just had a conversation yesterday with someone who wanted to like spin up some PCA, and we had a conversation about like the complexity to transparency trade-off there. And we have that quite regularly as a team. Oh, I didn't mean to progress my slides. That's fine. Okay, Logan, what types of optimization algorithms or tool do you use on a day-to-day basis? Lots of them. We are doing, I would say almost everything in data science is optimization. So all of our tree-based approaches are for optimizing. And then we have a lot of like custom things that pull all of it together to say, here are the constraints, here's what I'm trying to maximize, and please produce the best strategies to get there. From Felicity, the most surprising challenge that I have faced in my role. I think it's actually from outside of the technical work. So I started in 2018, and the political landscape has shifted dramatically even since then. So I think what's been the most challenging is how much more polarized everything has become in that interim. That was not something I think anybody anticipated at the time, and that the way that that impacts what it feels like to work in politics, I think is quite meaningful. And it was something that was unanticipated. I still can't imagine doing anything else with my professional time, but that's definitely was the most surprising kind of challenge that's come up. The other challenges, I think I kind of understood were gonna come my way. Andrew, do the analytical methods or objectives change depending on the level of election? From your experience, would a smaller campaign at a local level be able to implement some or all of this? So yes, the level of the campaign has a drastic impact on both the tools that you use, the way that the tools work, and how much capacity you have to use the tools. We do work with smaller campaigns, and there are sister committees in our space as well that work with even smaller campaigns. Our specialty at the DNC is the presidential, but we support above and beyond that. But there are sister committees whose specialty are the state level races. So the tools are still available to them. We have partnerships with vendors also who specialize in local election analytics tools that we provide at scale. So there's definitely the opportunity for that, but it depends a lot on individual factors. All right, I'm going to do one more and then finish up, but please feel free to keep dropping questions in there. Are there tools and resources you are looking to incorporate going forward? Also, does the RNC use similar processes or have any advantages? Yes, there's always stuff that we are looking to incorporate going forward. There's always new challenges. And I think that just gets more and more true every single day. And that the rate of change in our space is just increasing every single day. So that's one of the things that I definitely lose sleep over, is how to adapt to that increasing rate of change in particular. But we are always looking at that. That's like a big part of our team's culture, is how do we test things, new tools that are coming online, and vet those in a way that we can provide them with the rest of the ecosystem. And I do not know what the RNC is up to. All right, I will be back soon for more questions. I've progressed my slide twice now, it's fine. All right, so looking at these, starting to look at some of these particular case studies, looking at the voter contact side. So the first thing I want to re-up is this like resource constraints idea. Anytime I start talking about us preferencing our contact to certain parts of the electorate, people want to get very alarmed that we're leaving votes on the table, or that we're not talking to people that we should talk to. And again, ideally, we talk to every single person, but in our resource constrained environment, we need tools that are going to help us figure out where we're probably going to get the most impact for our use of resources. And that means making difficult trade-off decisions. So the other part is breaking out. We think like you show up on election day and you vote, that's like the behavior, but actually you can break that down into separate components. And one part is the probability that you will support the candidate that is on this campaign. The other one is the probability that you will actually show up and vote. So this is more of a like, your values dictate who it is that you support, but your voter engagement behavior dictates whether or not you're going to show up and vote. And those are two separate kind of behaviors, and we model them separately, but use that information together a lot in making our allocation decisions. Then we deliver a lot of these scores at the person level, and their probabilities that go to individual campaigns who are doing list building, which is deciding who to do contact with. And the cutoffs themselves are optimized for volunteer capacity, contact modes, and lots of other constraints. But this is to walk you through how we'll actually use some of these probabilities that we build as a team. So we can have these two axes here. One is the probability that you will support our candidate down here at the bottom. And the other one is the probability that you will turn out on E-Day, which is election day. They both go out to one being like, you will absolutely support our candidate, there is no doubt. And you will absolutely show up on election day to vote. There we go. So there's like a whole swath of people whose probability of supporting our candidate is extremely low. We have like lots of information that indicates that they're not going to vote for this candidate. There's nothing we can say or do that is going to change that. So it's not the best use of our resources to target our outreach on those individuals. So we can start right there by not focusing on those groups. There is another group of people who are definitely going to support our candidate and are definitely going to show up on election day, and they also don't need outreach. These are people like myself. You can look at my voting history and know exactly what I'm going to do on election day. I don't need the Democratic Party to reach out to me and make sure that I show up. I will show up. And there are plenty of other people in that category. Again, we don't want to take those people for granted, but when we are thinking about making resource allocation decisions with constraints, it is very rational to decide that we're not going to use our outreach efforts there. That might be our volunteer recruitment base, our fundraising recruitment base, but they don't need the same kind of voter contact outreach. So what's left? What's left are people who are we're not sure if they're going to support our candidate or not. And hopefully our not sure is somewhat correlated to their not sure, but they are likely to actually turn out on election day. And those people, we want to focus those persuasion events on. So we will create universes that are specifically for this type of activity, and then integrate some of that issue modeling work and volunteer training and set up situations where the point of talking to this person is to actually move them on their support, not on their probability of turning out on election day. So it's like a specific kind of way we engage with them based on what we know about them. The other part are people who are very likely to support our candidate, but less likely to show up on election day. And those people get a different kind of treatment. They are part of our Get Out the Vote campaigns, where the real focus is, again, getting them that information to show up on election day, or figuring out what it is that's keeping them from historically showing up for election days and doing our work to get them to show up on that day. So we have a really popular open source tool called I Will Vote that our engineers maintain. This isn't a data science project, but that matches every single person with their voting location and with information from their state Secretary of State who manages the voting process at a state level for how to get all of their voting resources together. So that's more of an information outreach event. So we're using the 2 scores and where you fall on both of those in order to kind of cater the way that we interact with you as part of our voter contact work. I'm going to skip this part for time and just touch lightly on the persuasion bit again. So this is another place where vendors are using a lot of experimental design, but what I like about persuasion is that it's like fascinating. It's very hard work, but it's also like very intellectually fascinating to me to think about the whole persuasion question. So we use a lot of our experimental design tools to think about that. Some of the questions you can ask yourself when you're thinking about that is like, how do we observe the event of persuasion? Any kind of statistical test we're doing in an experimental setting, we want to have a group, give them a treatment and see if the treatment worked and did the thing we wanted it to do. But how does one observe persuasion? What does that even mean? And after that, should you be able to nail down what it means to observe persuasion in an experimental setting, there is then more work to figure out, okay, we observe this persuasion event in this experimental setting. How do we replicate that in a non-experimental setting, specifically in a campaign in the campaign workflow? Like, what is something a political campaign can do that will replicate that experimental setting in an expected way? And then if you have gotten so far as to think, yes, me from this political campaign, I have created a situation where I have persuaded someone and I feel reasonably sure that the metrics I have in place to observe that are functional and are working. How long does that last? When do I need to do my persuasion event? If I persuade you to vote for my candidate in April, are you going to remember that in November? Is somebody else going to have persuaded you back the other way by November? What are the probabilities of all of those things happening? So there's lots of different ways we can optimize that whole problem set. Who do we talk to? What message do we give them? Which messenger? We have like the ability to decide who is going to talk to you about certain things. When do we do that? And again, focusing everything that we have on places where the result is most likely to be on the margin, and us pushing hundreds and thousands of votes around will actually make a difference in the outcome. Okay, I will close us out. So number one question I get on LinkedIn is, how do I get into politics? The thing I always say that I really mean is volunteer, get firsthand experience. Even if that means knocking doors and making phone calls, actually, especially if that means those things. I and I know this is not a minority opinion, I will be able to take you much more seriously if you can show me that you've actually worked on a campaign in a volunteer capacity, because that gives you an understanding of the questions that we work on at a level that is, it's just much deeper than what you will get elsewhere. And you know from being at this presentation today that we're using a lot of data science and analytics to put very specific people in front of you. And one of the things we optimize for is volunteer experience. We want you to have a positive experience because that is also going to make you more politically engaged. You're going to help us recruit other volunteers. It's going to be great. We don't want to be wasting our resources talking to people who are hostile to us anyway. So I think people don't realize it's not just like flipping through the phone book and picking someone to call and have a political conversation with. You actually have a lot of tools to ensure that it's going to be a reasonably positive experience. And then you can commiserate with the other volunteers when it's not positive. Organizations to connect with. The first tier here are some organizations that specifically do training for tech folks who want to do campaign work and help them make that transition. Folks that I've had really positive experiences with, Arena, DigiDems, and Tech for Campaigns. There's also the website Progressive Data Jobs that has like all manner of full-time jobs in the data arena. And then the other thing are these presidential campaigns, especially like last cycle, we had all of these primary campaigns spin up at the same time. And they were just so hungry for tech talent and data talent. It was really easy to get that first job through that mechanism. And then once you've had exposure to the kind of work that we do and the data sources that we use, it's much easier to move into other positions after that. And my final takeaways. So data science and analytics impact every part of the campaign cycle, from our exploratory analysis before there even is a campaign to election night. Our work has an impact at the margins, which is a perfect application for data science, or places where just like squeezing out a little bit more efficiency can really change the outcome of important events. My brand of data science is about optimization, resource allocation, and targeting, not about projecting outcomes. And please, if you come to me and want to get into this field or have really interesting ideas, and you have never volunteered on a campaign, I need you to at least check your ego about it. This is something that happens at conferences a lot, is that everyone, because they have like a peripheral understanding of how campaigns work, they have like figured out how to solve it. And they are not stopping to check with me about my thoughts about their idea before they're just pitching it as a way to solve it. So just a pro tip for interacting with me in particular, that I don't think will hold you back in interacting with others either. And then thank you. Also, we're hiring for 2022. There's my email address, and Democrats.org also has all these roles. These are just the tech team roles that we're hiring right now. It's all remote. We have different ways of processing it on the website, except for the IT help desk technician. That one is not remote. All right. And there's like a couple more questions I will try to get through really quickly. Okay, give us a flavor for how your team handles posts or doing election postmortems and implementing lessons learned for future efforts. So the really wonderful thing about the DNC being like the infrastructure place for the party is that we have specific time after elections where we do these like postmortem, which is to go back and look at like, how did everything work? Did all these products from ourselves, from the vendors, did they perform as we expected? Where did they not perform as expected? And to roll that into future research and development for our future products. Like that is the gold that we are able to provide by being full-time and by not disappearing after elections end. So that is, high level what we're doing on that front. Okay, from Connor. When modeling the probability of supporting our candidate, are you modeling a generic Democrat, or do you have candidate-specific adjustments? With decline in split ticket voting, it might not be as relevant. It's true, we do both. Depends on the campaign, depends on the use case, the resources that are available, lots of different factors, but both of those things happen. And the level of national versus local race also dictates how likely we are to see split ticket behavior, as well as plenty of other types of behaviors. From Becca, I work with You Can Vote, which is a nonpartisan group, and we engage in GOTV. Oftentimes, A lot of independent registered voters tell us they do not vote because they don't feel very well informed. What kind of information sources, tactics do you recommend for these voters? So I think a lot of, well, individual campaigns, again, are going to have specific resources that they use for specific things. I don't have anything high level that I recommend for all of those cases. I will say, I think a lot of that kind of information transfer in the literature anyway, it shows that a lot of that happens informally. So I think it happens informally through your social networks is most of how you do it. So there's a lot of focus right now on like how we replicate that with more network-based organizing, where you are hearing from organizers who are somehow in your network. So lots of different things there, but a tough question to get at. And I don't have any like high level recommendations that work for everything. Any tools that I use for performance testing? And we're using like model performance metrics thing. It depends on the use case. We'll pick from different things if we're interested in precision or recall or total accuracy, and pick our metrics at the beginning, look at those by different subgroups. And yeah, it's very use case dictated. And then finally from Evan, I assume that's similar to your economics background. Everyone has the answer regardless of how much knowledge or expertise they have. I don't know what I was talking about when you wrote that, so I can't offer any more on that, but.
Sorry, I was just trying to make a joke. You said people come up to you and they have the answer about how to do data science for polling. I've never volunteered. I don't know anything about it, but I've got the answer. Here's how it is. I've got a background in economics too, and I think that's similar. Yeah,
I just had this conversation with someone yesterday who was like, I took Econ 101 and it's all fake and you economists don't know what you're talking about. And I was like, okay, you didn't. It's hard when people have like this a little bit of experience with something and then think that thing where like you know a little bit and you think you know everything, and as you learn more you realize how much you don't know. We haven't like gone through that whole process with all of it.
Well, thank you, Viola. That was incredibly interesting, even for someone like me who's not a data science practitioner. So thank you so much for doing this. And thank you everyone for joining us and for all of your really thoughtful, really interesting questions as well. I hope you'll all join us for future Exploring Data Science webinars, and perhaps maybe you'll even consider hosting one in the future. So have a great day. And also it's International Women's Day. So happy International Women's Day to everyone who celebrates. Thank you all so much. That was really cool. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you for facilitating and wrangling me this week. I'm really
no worries. I don't mean to be like,
you have to be. You're like, are you going to show up for this event? I appreciate it. It was good to see you, Valerie.
Yes, likewise. Yeah, good luck with everything you're working on. All right. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.